Good evening and welcome. Just 12 hours to go before counting finally begins, and we'll know what the result of this general election is. But over the next 2 hours, we'll still take you through the ramifications of those exit polls and also a look back perhaps at the Modi legacy. First up though, how the world is viewing Narendra Modi and what his foreign policy legacy has been in particular. There's lots to talk about there, Vasu.
Absolutely. It's interesting that as Mr. Modi begins to wind down into his first term and is perhaps set to begin a second term, that there does appear to be now somewhat of a change in the way the world is seeing him, or at least the way the world media is seeing him. From the initial days when he was celebrated as this great reformer, someone who could transform India, a series of articles recently in leading international publications have actually taken a fairly sharp, critical tone of Mr. Modi. And let's, Nidhi, quickly put up a summary of some of the things that have been said about him recently, which have sparked a lot of the debate. And if we look, of course, at the famous Time magazine cover story, which called him a divider-in-chief, that piece by Aatish Taseer, which said, far from the promise of development for all, he's achieved a state in which Indians are increasingly obsessed with their differences. The Ian Bremmer piece, of course, in that same magazine said India still needs change and Modi remains the person most likely to deliver. But then there was The Economist, which virtually endorsed a vote against Narendra Modi, saying his biggest fault is his relentless stoking of Hindu-Muslim tensions. And a recent piece in The Guardian by Kapil Komireddy, which said that if he succeeds, Hindu nationalism will become the official animating ideology of the Republic. Ouch.
Ouch, indeed. And it is funny also when you look at some of these articles, particularly the Time magazine one, because in 2012, Vasu, they had that famous cover or that infamous cover of Manmohan Singh, where they called him the underachiever.
Right.
And the BJP held a press conference at that time, saying that
going
to town with it. The Congress was miffed, and you've had the tables turned now with this entire issue of Narendra Modi. But Mr. Modi's foreign policy has been something also that has been under the spotlight all these years, whether it was his swearing in, if you remember, and how all those SAARC leaders were invited, including Nawaz Sharif, to how he's dealt with the United States, Japan, China, and of course Pakistan. All of that has been up for considerable debate, and so there's lots to talk about in the next 60 minutes. Let me go straight across to our panelists here in the studio. We have Dhruv Jaishankar, who is a fellow for foreign policy with the Brookings Institution here in India. Salman Soz is a spokesperson of the Congress. We'll begin with you, Dhruv. Firstly, all this sort of fuss over these international articles, what do you make of them? Do you see a change in the way the international media at least views Mr. Modi in these 5 years?
I think that's somewhat predictable. I think many will recall that The Economist 5 years ago also wrote a similar article that was quite critical of Prime Minister Modi. At that time, he was a candidate, of course. But I would look at that with a bit of a grain of salt. I mean, these represent in some ways elite opinions in many other countries. If you look, I think, at substantively at what has changed, not just in the last 5 years, but in the last several years, I think even going beyond that, I think you do see a greater appreciation for India around the world. And I think some of this is just structural. It has to do with the fact that the Indian economy is growing, even though it could arguably be growing much better and much faster. But you see this reflected in how much, say, the Gulf countries are paying attention to India, how much increasingly Southeast Asia is looking to India, not just on commercial and economic matters, but on security matters, how much Japan, Russia, the US have all paid attention. A renewal of EU-India strategic partnership, which for a while had gone a little quiet.
So you're saying there are solid achievements to
No,
boast
I think there's some tangible changes. Some of it, I think, can be attributed to the Prime Minister's personal energies. But I think other things have to do structurally with the changes that have taken place, both in India. On the other hand, I think there are also some areas which have been somewhat underwhelming. And one has been in the commercial area. We have seen an absence of completed trade negotiations. I think another one is just a lack of internal reforms. The first few years, we saw an increase in FDI that has sort of plateaued off after that. So I think these are areas that have been relatively underwhelming. I think from the point of view of particularly business communities around the world.
All right. I believe we actually have Aatish Taseer with us, joining us via Skype, the author of that Time magazine piece, a divider-in-chief. Let's just put up that cover, that cover image which sparked so much controversy. Aatish, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Just first, straight off the bat, to ask you, what has life been like after the piece came out?
Well, It's been very tumultuous because the Prime Minister used the pulpit or the sort of bully pulpit of being the Prime Minister to advance this lie that I was a Pakistani. He knows very well that I'm not a Pakistani. He knows who my mother is. He knows that I grew up in India. And so when the Prime Minister himself goes for you like that, then it kind of like emboldens his trolls. And it also like creates this environment where Pakistani is used almost as a kind of way to bait Muslims. And I think a lot of Indians have felt like that recently. And my God, if I'm Pakistani, like you can just imagine what ordinary Indian Muslims are going through. So it's been pretty ugly.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Well, Aatish, just explain to us though about how your own view of Narendra Modi changed over these years, because you did believe in 2014 that he was someone who brought in a positive agenda, there was hope, and what you've written today is very much the opposite of that. Now, Dhruv Jaishankar here believes that much of what is being written in the foreign media about Mr. Modi is in a sense predictable, but is it? Do you see a discerning change in how he's being looked at?
Absolutely. You have to understand this notion of Hindu phobia or people not wanting India to succeed is a fantasy. Like, as my friend, I have a friend in the House of Lords who said to me, everyone wishes India very well. And so when they threw up a Prime Minister like Modi, who promised economic reform, who promised a kind of seriousness, he himself had these amazing credentials which were a testament to the power of this democracy. Everyone wanted him to do well. And I was very much part of that camp. But what you've seen is a very, very low energy when it comes to economic reform, a lot of bombast, we've seen that, and a very willful engendering of an ugly atmosphere in India with the strategic use of silence. I mean, this is not a silent man, he's an extremely voluble man. So when he is silent in killing after killing to create this atmosphere, he's doing it deliberately. And I think that has filtered out, news of that has filtered out into the world beyond, and people are fairly revolted, as they should be.
But Aatish, let me just, push back a little bit on the suggestion that you said that this was something that you discovered as we went along. Now, clearly when one assesses political leaders, the basic test is one looks at their record. What about Mr. Modi's record before he ran for office or before he became Prime Minister gave you the sense that he was in fact some sort of modernizing reformer?
Because he started to speak a different language, and I thought this man has a certain history, he has an RSS past. Firstly, there was a history of sectarian violence in India, and I thought maybe he wants to turn a corner. And the politics of India is not the politics of stable Western democracies. We have to allow for people to put prejudices behind them. We have to allow for growth in our politicians. And I guess I was taking him on his word. I've said before that I made a terrible mistake.
Okay. But then, Aatish, what was your turning point in that sense? Was there a moment or moments?
The first killing. Between the first killing, between a clerk and the appointment of Yogi Adityanath, I thought this man means nothing but harm for India. And now he's out in the open. He calls me a Pakistani, but he's the one fielding a terrorist in the election. I mean, so this is somebody in whom, like, criminality, that side of nationalism, which we saw in the 30s, where it was inseparable from criminality, that has really come forward. And so there's no illusion anymore. He's not trying to hide what he really is.
And when you say that, Aatish, if indeed he does come back to power, which appears likely based on the exit polls at least, what do you think that would mean for India? If there is going to be sort of no pretensions about what kind of nationalism Mr. Modi and his party stand for, what do you think that means?
I think that the force that he's unleashed is bigger than he is. And there's not going to be a moment where he perhaps will even be capable of putting it all back. And so you now see an arc towards the kind of leader that the BJP is putting forward. And that arc runs through from Yogi Adityanath to Pragya Thakur, even Amit Shah, Sargesh, full of ugly rhetoric. This is the kind of leadership that's unfolding before us, and I don't see any reason to feel that especially now, that there would be a turnaround on that. I think we would see much more of that.
Right. Aatish, I just had two questions. One was that this was just more like a sort of logistical question, that when this came out as a Time cover story, was that something that was, in a sense, a decision of the magazine itself, that they had sort of decided that they would frame the piece like that, and that's sort of what they believed that, of what Mr. Modi was, and then, got you to write it? That was the first question. And the second question was that, going back to what Nidhi was saying, that at the end of the day, you're saying that people around the world are noticing the fact that there has been this shift in India, that Mr. Modi's politics have changed, and there's this disgust. But is that just amongst, I don't know, the readers of Time or the readers of Guardian? Are world governments and world leaders also waking up to that, or is it just this sort of liberal bubble that believes that there's been this great shift?
Let me answer your second question first. Everyone is extremely preoccupied with their own affairs right now. So to expect that there's going to be some kind of general consensus in the world about India at all is perhaps too much to ask. And the readers who are not reading Time magazine are certainly not concerned with India anyway.
Right.
But to answer your first question, of course that's not true. One pitches a story, one writes the story, and then the magazine decides where it should be placed. They decide the headline,
right.
and that's how it works. It's never, you never go out looking for a writer to do a hit job. I mean, that's just not how magazine journalism in the West works, or perhaps even in India.
Well, Aatish, just one final question. One of the big things that Mr. Modi has done in the last few years is sort of put NRIs on the map. And, in the first 2-3 years, at least when he was traveling abroad, you had those big stadium shows, where he was addressing the Indian communities in these various countries. Now, I'm sure you interact with a lot of Indians there. Their love affair with Mr. Modi is still intact, if not even if not greater. And
absolutely.
I mean, despite what the international media may write about him.
Absolutely. And the love affair of the Pakistani, non-resident Pakistani is still intact with Imran Khan. I'm afraid these people live a completely distorted reality where they want this kind of jingoistic leader to make the name of India famous in the world. And they're quite insulated from reality. Like, they have their Western lives, but they're secretly kind of hankering after the prestige of India, and they live like a completely probably like one of the most isolated realities I know. So it is intact, but I don't think that means anything.
Right. Before we let you go, Aatish, are you going to be able to come back to India?
Well, I want to say on this channel that if I'm not let back in India, I would like you to defend me, because it would be a very, very ugly turn of events if I was, because of what I was writing. I who've lived in India till the other day for a decade, if I was not let back into the country, it would be like a really awful thing to have happen, and it shouldn't be allowed. So I hope I'm allowed back in, but if I'm not, I'd like you to stand up and make a hue and cry.
All right, well, if we're around, we promise to. If we are around, we promise to have you on. Anyway, on that light note, Aatish, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks very much, Aatish.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank
we have
you so
Ambassador
much.
Meera Shankar here in the studio with us. She was, of course, India's ambassador to the United States and to Germany. We have Shaina NC of the BJP. You can see Suhasini Eder, the national editor of The Hindu, who's, of course, been the diplomatic editor of The Hindu as well. And James Crabtree is joining us from Singapore tonight. He's a writer and journalist. Ambassador Meera Shankar, to you first. What did you think of the Time magazine piece, Aatish's and Ian's?
Well, I think, let me put it like this, that there's one view which states have of Prime Minister Modi, and he is seen as a strong leader and as one who had got a decisive mandate in the last elections in India. And to the extent that India's weight in global affairs has increased, any leader with an elected mandate in India would be taken seriously. So some of it has to do with Mr. Modi himself, but much of it also has to do with India's own weight in global affairs, which is increasing. The second thing is that Prime Minister Modi has taken India far closer strategically to the United States and has derived, in a sense, the benefit of the positive coverage and relationships which have flowed with the West overall, flowing from the relationship with the United States.
Right.
Now, in liberal and intellectual circles, and even within the governments, there has been concern also, at sectarianism and what this implies for social harmony in India and social cohesiveness going into the future. So even if you look at the Trump administration's religious freedom report, you know,
which every
it's
year
the Congress,
lists,
it comes every year.
Yeah.
It has, you know, put India on the mat
Yeah.
on the issue of declining religious freedom, again press freedoms. I think we've come down, you know, several notches in the rankings. But I don't think in terms of the overall relationship between the governments that these issues are given priority, because there is this overall strategic coming
Okay, so it's sort
together.
of realpolitik in the sense that
I think
yeah.
that you know, there has also been concern
yeah.
that India has performed
Again?
below potential economically, because there was this hope
Yeah,
when he
that-
was
that
elected,
mandate, yeah.
and that was his overall message
Yeah.
in the
Which is
last
what,
election.
right, Dhruv was also making that point.
उनको आइसक्रीम भी
Yeah.
Okay, Shaina NC
दिखाओ
is
डब्बा।
with us. Shaina NC,
Yeah. Yes,
first of all,
I am. Yes.
will Aatish Taseer be allowed back into India?
So mean to ask her that.
I mean, is this a question to even
I'm
ask
just-
today?
I'm
Please,
joking, I'm joking.
I hope
I'm
that
jo-
you
I-
as a
I
channel
am
will
joking,
finally
I'm
give
joking. We
credit
can have-
where is due.
we can
You
have
know,
some
this
space
is
for
so
humor.
typical, and that's why I think 10 times before, think 10 times before saying yes.
Come on, Shaina, you
really,
need to-
you can
Shaina,
be
you need to
legitimate
learn how to
voices
take a
of
joke.
dissent.
I was
One
just
second,
kidding.
it is a day of celebration. I am absolutely fine with you joking around, but you're joking around 365 days of the year. At least give credit to this
Oh my
man
God.
who has made
Wow.
history.
Shit.
He
Get
has
serious now.
made,
Yeah.
a,
I
of
have a
course,
parallel
it's not
career as a stand-up.
anti-incumbency. Let me have my say.
Okay.
Let me have my say.
Okay.
It's not anti-incumbency, it's pro-incumbency. And pro-incumbency in itself, in a scenario such as this, is something that needs to be looked into too. Why is it that crores and crores of Indians, despite the bashing and the calling, Chaukidar chor hai, unpad hai, gawar hai, Aurangzeb hai, why have they not accepted this narrative?
But
Why
Shaina-
has there
To
been
kal
no
pata chalega
communal
na.
violence in this
That's not
country
the
for
debate.
5 years?
We-
Why
we-
is it
we
that
will know the
India
results
is on
tomorrow.
such a high in the international scenario?
Shaina, just a second. That's not the debate here. The debate is whether there is some sort of shift in the way that the world, or at least the world media, perceives Mr. Modi, and to get your response to these series of pieces that have come out from The Economist, from Time, from other publications, which have raised serious concerns about his track record, especially when it comes to the question of minorities and the question of social
So,
strife.
well, there are many other articles. Look, I don't think we're in a competition as to who has praised Prime Minister Modi and who has been critiquing him. If you go into an analysis of how many people have appreciated him on the international platform, how many magazines have appreciated his work, the list is endless. But I don't think that is the area of debate. The area of debate is that here you have a legitimate leader who is who is winning a mandate, and I'm saying winning because tomorrow hasn't come yet,
Yes.
but winning a mandate on popular sentiment of Indians in India and Indians living abroad, all of whom idolize him because of his hard work, honesty, and non-compromise on corruption, and doing away with special status, which a lot of elite thought that they could always maneuver around. I think that could be the area of focus. Why is India at par with other international superpowers today? Because of Prime Minister Modi's communication, relationships, and the intrinsic good of all Indians, be it the technocrats, bureaucrats, the citizens as well. So, but I think this is
So
a
you're
matter
not
of
you're not
pride.
too bothered
It's
by
not a
Time magazine
matter
or
of
Economist
critiquing
or
on
the
eve
Economist
of results.
China, you're not. You're basically saying that
Absolutely
you're not bothered by all that.
I'm not bothered by wagging tongues who have done nothing this whole election but to bash Prime Minister Modi, and the more they have bashed, the more he has emerged victorious, because his motto has always been not to be voted to come to power, but to be voted to serve people. And please understand,
So
the first
when-
time in the history of India, you
Right.
don't have an anti-incumbency, you have a pro-incumbency for a single party.
Now, these are all assumptions that you're making on the basis of a verdict which hasn't even come out, but leave that aside. When you say that this is bashing or these are tongues wagging, both these pieces or several of these pieces have cited instances outlining why they believe that there is a real reason to fear the sort of politics Mr. Modi has patronized, whether it's the lynching, whether it's the treatment of minorities. So these are not just assertions made in the air. Are all of these to be brushed aside as wagging tongues? And the author is called a Pakistani. The guy who writes it, the Prime Minister calls him a Pakistani when he's not. Shaina NC?
Look, I'm not going to get into individual comments because I don't think that that is befitting for me to comment or anybody else. Everyone is entitled to have the freedom and the choice of words and adjectives that they choose to on whatever issue. But for him to be using words to say that, oh, you have fielded a terrorist, isn't the basic premise that you're innocent until proven guilty? Isn't the basic premise that if you've served a 9-year sentence and you have been beaten with belts and all kinds of questions that have arisen from the previous dispensation as to saffron terror and Hindu terror,
and the charges were framed just a few months ago.
Who created?
She's on trial for terrorism. She's not exonerated.
Just hear the counter narrative.
We've heard the narrative, but she's still on trial for terrorism. I said
If
the other day she's not on trial for stealing a wallet. It's a very serious charge.
Who started the terminology Hindu terror and saffron terror?
She is being charged under a terrorism law.
Was it not the then Home Minister called Sushil Kumar
She is
Shinde?
being charged under
an
anti-terror law.
Case of communal
under
riots
which the
for 5
JKLF was
years.
banned in Jammu and Kashmir
Look,
the other day.
Nidhi,
the same law is the law that she's being tried under. She's not exonerated. I mean, how can you defend giving a ticket to Pragya Thakur even now?
May I just speak?
You're supposed to be one of the more sensible people, yaar.
May I just say, no, I'm giving you a counter to what Aatish just said on your show. I'm not here to sit on a brief. I am here to say that if for all those who critique Prime Minister Modi, at least look at the good policies. You've touched 22 crore lives, Labhartis who have benefited through 133 schemes. Right. You have schemes like Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, Nirmal Bharat, of course, Ujjwala that have reached 6.5 crore homes. You have Mudra Banking which has touched 70%
don't know what
women.
People are going to do.
You have Jan Dhan, which is viewed as the largest financial inclusion scheme.
Okay,
let's get the others to talk about.
Yeah,
and this is the first election. Let me just finish one point.
Let's
this is
widen
the first
the debate.
election. We have not been discussing on secularism and discussing on development, discussing on issues
really? Which
election
were you part of? Which election campaign?
Deep into Godse, Mandir, Hindu, Muslim more than we've been in the past 5 years. Anyway, James Crabtree.
Who has?
Okay. We know who has, but anyway, James Crabtree, to get you in on this, again, on this debate about the way that the world media has been writing about Mr. Modi, A, do you see a shift in that? And B, James, the same question that we asked Aatish as well, is that just something which is, sort of the preoccupation of a certain sort of liberal consensus even in the West? Or is that also starting to come under the radar of governments that do business with India?
I mean, I think it's a mixture of both. There's a curious contradiction in the way that India is viewed. Really, if you're a Western government, actually you quite like Modi. He gives the impression that India is a strong country. It makes it credible to view India as a potential superpower because he has this reputation as a strong leader. Equally, he's an ally against China, not an actual ally, but a kind of countervailing force. And so, as was said earlier, people sort of want India to succeed in the West. However, most Western journalists, of which I am one, and the authors of all of these pieces are all liberals. So they are concerned with minority rights, liberal rights, particular kinds of freedoms. And so I think it's perfectly fair to say that the Western media is a kind of liberal bubble. These are issues that tend to concern the type of people who write in those publications. And so there is a growing worry about Modi and where he's going. Relatively speaking, I think it would be fair to say that actually compared to the other world leaders you have to deal with, again, Modi looks pretty good. He looks better than Putin. He looks better than Xi. He has been less problematic than these other strongmen leaders that Western governments have to deal with. But there is a worry that over the course of a second term, he might, as somebody like Erdogan did, become gradually more and more extreme, or his extreme supporters might wield more and more influence. So I think that the picture is is complicated. It's not that everybody thinks Modi is bad. Actually, many people in the West wish India well and want it to become a stronger power for geopolitical reasons. But there are worries about what will happen if the worst instincts of the BJP prevails.
That's interesting, the comparison that you've made with Erdogan. And Suhasini, just to come in on that, I mean, James Crabtree says that, you know, Western leaders are probably happier dealing with Mr. Modi compared with other strongmen that they have to deal with otherwise, like Mr. Putin. These are not very flattering sort of comparisons, though.
Well, let's be honest, the age of strongmen is upon us. From the United States to China to, as James pointed out, Turkey to Hungary to India to Indonesia to Philippines. You know, wherever you're looking, you are looking at very, very populist leaders coming to power. And it's a reality that whoever is elected by the people of India is somebody that everyone will have to deal with. You know, I was interested by what the BJP spokesperson said right now about the fact that this is the first time in history that India is seeing a pro-incumbency vote. I would say just 10 years ago in 2009, we saw a prime minister being re-elected after he had actually gone into elections on a foreign policy issue. One could argue that there was a foreign policy issue in this election as well. But I don't think it changes dramatically how you know, the outside world sees you. Today's day is much more transactional. It's much more business-like. Most governments are saying, right, so you've won an election, or okay, there's a new government in power, they've won an election, let's deal with them. After all, when Prime Minister Modi came in 2014, many had wondered what was going to happen with the United States that had treated him so badly, denied him a visa for a decade, and everyone wondered what would happen. And actually the US just went ahead, made the call on the first day and said, right, you've been elected the leader of India, we're going to deal with you. And I think if we move a little bit away from just the idea of whether one personality is who the people are dealing with, I think it's actually, in today's day, everyone is looking at other countries and saying, we'll deal with whoever's there. And I think that's how India is looking at other countries as well. That's how we saw the Trump election, it's how we look at Pakistan as well.
Right. You know, Salman Soz, the point is that whatever Time magazine may say or the Guardian may say, the sort of bottom line is, and as someone who's also traveled in these elections, when you go across this country, you talk to voters, they're hugely impressed with this idea that India's standing in the world has gone up in the past 5 years, and Mr. Modi is at the heart of it. So no matter how many bad front page Time covers he gets, it plays very well where it counts amongst voters.
Well, yes, it does, because there's a lot of propaganda around what Mr. Modi does. But, you know, to be fair, when he got the mandate that he did, and it was a huge mandate, and he went on his foreign trips, and early on he was treated like a rock star by non-resident Indians. And of course, you know, he's the Prime Minister of India. India is one of the biggest economies in the world. It's the second biggest country by population. So it is an important country. So tomorrow it may not be Mr. Modi, it could be somebody else who becomes Prime Minister, and that Prime Minister will get the respect of the international community, because by virtue of being the head of government of such a...
But you don't agree with Dhruv, but he said that he has also taken steps to improve India's standing in the world with key countries, USA, China.
So did Dr. Manmohan Singh. So did Mr. Vajpayee. Every Prime Minister comes and makes improvements, and one Prime Minister stands on the shoulders of another Prime Minister. Foreign policy for India is basically, it's a continuum. You don't just say that, okay, one guy comes in and then suddenly everything is gone. Tomorrow you could have, say, for example, Prime Minister Mayawati. Does that mean that India will be viewed less favorably? No.
Are you telling us something we don't know?
No, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying. I'm just giving you an example. I'm just giving you an example. So, there are structural reasons, as Dhruv said.
But would you, if you had to give him credit for something on the foreign policy front in the last 5 years, what would it be? Honestly.
No. We've already talked about some of the things. Like the ambassador has mentioned these already. I don't want to repeat those. But we have some serious issues, say, with China. What has China done in the last 5 years, and what have we done? That is important. But then there are other aspects that we must be very, very careful about. You know, when you talk about social cohesion in a country of this size, so diverse, and by the way, India, as this multicultural democracy, this crazy country, this colorful country.
Yeah.
People love that idea outside.
Yeah.
People love India, Gandhi's India. That's what they love. When you take a terror accused and put that person as a parliamentary candidate, that will diminish India's reputation internationally. That will hurt all the good work that different governments have done over the years, and it will have ramifications. Do not for a moment think that people will not take notice of it.
I want to ask Ambassador Meera Shankar about that. That does any kind of social disharmony and all play out on the minds of, for instance, foreign investors? It would, because it has an impact on the economy. They'll think 100 times before putting their money here. Or do you think that they override some of this?
Certainly, I think anybody thinking of foreign direct investment, which means that you're taking a longer term risk where you put in money and you're developing something, I think this would matter to them more than to foreign institutional investors. But anything which makes the economy more rocky, obviously is a factor which they take into account. And even our own businesses, for instance, are concerned when there's a sharp increase in polarization, because essentially for business, it's one market. That's what they would like to see. They don't want to distinguish between consumers on the basis of either their religion, their ethnicity, or others. For them, the bigger the market, the better. And I think these are issues which do impinge.
Okay.
Can I come in? Because I waited the longest and spoke the least. So give me a minute now. The point is, the Indian economy is an attractive thing for foreign investors and foreign governments. Now, I can tell you, as a student of economics, that social disharmony and economic progress do not go hand in hand. And that will have ramifications for this country. And by the way, I was hopeful too, like any other citizen. I was also hopeful for this government, because I thought a government could, after 30 years, we have a single party government. And then they would, wait. Then they would go in for reforms that this country badly needs, and they did not. And I wrote a book about it. I was disappointed too.
Okay,
I wrote a book about it.
Yes, I wrote a book about it.
Shaina, the idea that social disharmony is something that could scare away foreign investors, worry foreign governments?
Where is the social disharmony?
Well, clearly not in your home, but in many of our homes. I'm sorry, Shaina. What are you talking about?
Section of society.
Salman,
come and live in my house, and then you will.
Salman, let us speak. Yes.
Please, please let me have my say. I'm not in a shouting match here. I'm very clear on one thing, that when we talk about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, policies, when you give rural electrification, when you give better infrastructure, when you give housing facilities, when you give Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, is that dividing people on basis of who's Hindu, who's Muslim, who's Sikh, who's Christian, who's Parsi? Absolutely not. When you have a Jan Dhan Yojana or a Mudra Banking or an Ujjwala that reaches 6.5 crore homes, is that not inclusive? And what is this social disharmony you're talking about? For the first time in the history of India, you've had social disharmony, that you have only pandered to vote bank politics. For the first time, you've had a triple talaq, which has given dignity to women alike, irrespective of what caste, creed, community she belongs to, and given her the status of being her. I think that this is a big thing to talk about, and that coexists with an economic growth. We do understand that there are lots of problems in a large country as India, and we need to work much harder. But the people of India seem to be much more intelligent than a few select panelists who only have one agenda to bash at Prime Minister Modi.
But
the people of India realize that
I just want to say here, Shaina,
is no question
that
intent.
Who could those panelists be? But you know, the problem with that argument, honestly, is that just because a leader is popularly elected and has a majority does not mean that dissenting or minority views should be ignored or brushed aside as being irrelevant or anti-national. So if we could try to change that discourse just a little bit in the next 5 years, we would be grateful.
Hindutva means justice to all and appeasement to none. Please, with utmost humility, and you know that I never get excited on debates, so please, let me please say it with absolute composure that what does Hindutva mean? It means justice to all and appeasement to none. If we are endeavoring towards a strong, unified, nationalistic country where nation first, party
next, are we heading to becoming a Hindu Rashtra? Do you want to declare that too? Is that the next step? But how much of this Dhruv Jaishankar is going to matter in world capital?
You can have your own reading and your own agenda. I'm not going to fall into that
because what James Crabtree was basically saying is that at the end of the day, and what Suhasini said, is that world relationships today are very transactional. But do you think a point comes where other governments will turn around and say, okay, we're not comfortable with what's going on in India?
I would largely agree with James' assessment and Suhasini's as well. I mean, I think we are moving in that direction. Certainly, I think most governments have indicated, that they have been willing to work with this government. They will be willing to work with others. India has faced, as Suhasini rightly pointed out, similar choices in engaging with other governments as well, whether it's the US,
even
Brazil, Pakistan certainly. But I think just to get back to the issue of the media and how much it matters. I mean, I'm consistently struck, and this is not just recently, I think this, not just in the last 5 years, but even before that, sometimes how out of tune the international media is, with some notable exceptions, James actually being one of them, with sometimes I would say the realities. I mean, India is a very complex place, but just simply some basic facts. I'll give you one example. Before Prime Minister Modi was elected, there was a widespread belief, and you saw this in the coverage, that he would be somebody who had no foreign policy experience, would not care much about foreign policy, that he would not like the US because of the visa ban against him, that on a number of things. And I simply did something rather simple, which I just went and listened to the speeches and interviews that he gave on foreign policy. He in fact gave 3 speeches just on foreign policy before he was elected, and he in several interviews as well. And he was quite clear that he wanted to improve ties with the US. He said some very interesting things. He wanted to create a G20 for solar power, which we have an international solar alliance now. Yeah. He wanted to import high-speed rail from Japan, again, something that has started. He wanted to both engage with China and Pakistan, but also Shanti, he spoke about Shanti and Shakti, that he wanted to also push back against both of them on certain issues. So a lot of that has come to pan out. And the fact that
you're saying that the media
just
not have fully caught that.
Which I think is indicative of
all right, Shana, just one thing I want to ask you, because we're running out of time. Just looking forward now, in the event that there is going to be now a Modi Sarkar 2.0, what are some of the changes, if at all, we're likely to see? Because one of the sort of accusations that Mr. Modi faced on his foreign visits is that generally foreign policy was not seen to be a political platform, especially when you're outside the country. You're not supposed to take political pot shots at your rivals, which is something that he did do on occasion when he did his foreign trips. Is that something which you think could have been avoided, and will that change?
Look, I'm just a small party worker, and I don't think that I'm in a position to give advice on who should be doing. Our leadership is always been democratic. There have been multiple occasions where there have been legitimate voices of dissent, viewpoints, countering viewpoints, and people who have agreed, people who have disagreed, all of which has been taken in good spirit. But I think the largest story is for Prime Minister Modi. He is one person who has given up everything for nation building and for this country, and for every breath of his
was not my
breathes
question.
India and Bharat at the international. No, let me please say. So I'm not here to sit and give advice on who should be doing. That's not my role, and it's not my line. I clearly want to say that yes, we as a country want to make sure that India is not just a superpower, but every policy that has been started in these 5 years continues and concludes and reaches the poorest of poor, and that is the agenda, and that should be the viewpoint. And as I said in my opening line, there are few people who wanted to be voted to power. We want to vote to serve society.
All right. Well, so Hasini, just if you had a crystal ball of Mr. Modi as Prime Minister again, I want to ask you about Pakistan. Are we going to see a Mr. Modi hugging Mr. Imran Khan in the next few months if you had to stick your neck out? Anything is possible in India-Pakistan relations. Or do you think these tensions are going to continue?
Being invited to the swearing-in?
Anything can happen.
No, I think there is a definite understanding that some kind of engagement will follow. And let's remember, between mid-June, when the SCO meeting happens and the two prime ministers will be there, to November when Kartarpur Sahib corridor opens. I think both New Delhi and Islamabad understand they have, they have their task cut out. They have to use that time to ensure that one, Pakistan is kept under check when it comes to terrorism, but also that some kind of space is made so that in November, both sides can come together to celebrate the opening of that corridor, something that Prime Minister Modi said last year was akin to the Berlin Wall falling. So I think there'll be an element of realism in the way he deals with Pakistan. But I think, Nidhi, any prime minister who wins tomorrow is going to have his task cut out on so many foreign policy issues. There's going to be the decision on Iran and sanctions and how they will deal with the energy prices that follow. There's going to be the decision on business and how to deal with the US that could be announcing its withdrawal of GSP status and what India agrees to do over there. You're going to see deadlines when it comes to free trade agreements, things like RCEP, the other free trade agreement negotiations with other countries.
Right.
So I think there's going to be a very full foreign policy platter, and anyone who, if Prime Minister Modi takes over or whoever takes over, they're going to have to hit the floor running.
Right. You asked about Imran Khan. Imran Khan actually said it'd be a good idea if Modi becomes Prime Minister again.
I know, he
endorsed
actually did.
it.
He
Remember
endorsed
that?
it.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the Pakistanis want him to be the Prime Minister. I'm pretty sure of that.
Why?
Because he's actually weakening this country by following a policy of divide and rule, which is basically the British policy. That's what. Look, let's just cut the BS. When the president of the when the president of
all this time was BS.
Yeah, there's a lot of BS that I heard from China. But when the president of the ruling party says that migrants from Bangladesh, basically Muslims, are termites, that is not sabka saath sabka vikas. That is basically an open call that there is a group that is the other. That is what this party wants to do, and that if you're a strategic player in China, in Pakistan, you want somebody who will divide India. You want somebody who will weaken India. This is what the RSS and the BJP are doing. They think that they're trying to create a stronger India. They're actually creating a weaker India. That's what we are fighting against. That's what we will continue to fight.
And that's why you're saying Pakistan wants him back. But
yes,
Meera Shankar, if you were to sort of again use your crystal ball to gaze, dealing with Pakistan will be one of the tricky issues, and there's a whole host of others that Suhasini pointed out. But is it true that Mr. Modi would be the best bet for trying to get some progress made with Pakistan, or is that a misnomer?
The Pakistani reasoning, if I may, project that, is that a strong right-wing leader will be more capable of selling any agreement than a liberal leader or weaker leader who would then face criticism from the right in a very systematic fashion. So that is the Pakistani reasoning.
But that would have been a legitimate assumption,
and
let's
I
say
think
5 years ago.
For the Pakistanis...
But that didn't happen, right?
For the Pakistani army, I would say, having a degree of threat from India also enables them to, strengthen their dominant role within the polity, get more resources.
But instead of that,
so in that sense, it plays to them, to their advantage.
But that could have happened 5 years ago, Dhruv, but that didn't happen. In fact, equations with Pakistan are perhaps, I don't know if an all-time low, but are certainly not great.
I have to say, not to Mr. Modi. I mean, he reached out. He did what he could.
So until June, July of 2016, I think you saw a steady set of attempts. It was actually repeated attempts at engagement with Pakistan. In fact, in early surveys in 2015, 2016, the one issue that the Prime Minister got very negative responses to in public opinion surveys was his engagement with Pakistan, in fact, in the first 2 years. We saw a change in the summer of 2016. For a number of reasons. I think that a number of things coincided at that time. And since then, we've seen a relationship in deep freeze. And in that time, we had the Uri attack, we had Pathankot, we had so-called surgical strikes, we had Balakot, of course, as a response. That continues. That has continued, as Suhasini pointed out, under the Imran, even though there's been a change in government in Pakistan. We have seen now for the first time in External Affairs Ministers meeting at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit just a day or two ago. But I suspect we will still see a full court press on Pakistan for the simple reason that I think the power balance has shifted to a great deal in India's favor, largely to do with the failures of the Pakistani economy, which for all the problems we have here.
Okay, so you don't see much shift.
I think there will be a temptation to push forward with India's agenda. I think the Masood Azhar listing was an indication of that.
If I may also just add that, it won't be a priority. There are many other broader foreign policy priorities which will take precedence. This is going to be one of the issues the government will have to grapple with, but the broader issues will be structuring relations with the great powers, the US, China. Russia, China, getting the economy off,
get everything going. Okay, quick last comments from everybody. If they'd like to, isolate one thing that the new government should immediately do, what should that be, starting with you, Suhasini?
Well, I think actually the new government or Prime Minister Modi being re-elected should start where he started in 2014. Go back to the neighborhood, go back to India's understanding of being a South Asian country. I think there's so much that has happened in the neighborhood in the last few months in particular, but also over the last few years, which India is sort of missing out on. It's not just about China's inroads, it's not just about the fact that this is becoming an area of contention between the great powers, but about India's own perception of itself and where it sees itself.
Right.
So I would say, go back to that, maybe invite all the leaders back in for the swearing in.
Okay.
Oh my God, thanks for that, Suhasini, because this hasn't been a long enough election. Let's make the swearing in very grand again. All right, thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. It's been a very interesting conversation looking back at Mr. Modi's foreign policy legacy, perhaps the challenges ahead and how he's being viewed internationally.